The thermometer outside Elias Kern's dugout shelter read 43 degrees below zero, and the wind howled across the Montana mountains with enough force to strip bark from trees. Inside his earth-covered bunker, sitting 8 feet below the surface, Elias worked in his shirt sleeves while the blizzard of 1895 raged above him, unaware that every other prospector within 30 miles was fighting for survival. Before we go deeper, let us know in the comments if you've ever experienced a winter storm that changed how you think about shelter, and if stories of frontier survival speak to you. Hit subscribe because tomorrow's tale might just save your life someday. The winter of 1894 began wrong. Elias Kern noticed it in October when the aspens dropped their leaves 2 weeks late and the ground squirrels seemed confused about when to disappear into their burrows. He had spent 9 winters in the Montana mountains, long enough to read the subtle language of seasons, and everything about this year whispered warnings that most men ignored. Elias worked a silver claim in a remote valley 30 miles northwest of Helena, partnered with a man named James Brennan, who had come west from Pennsylvania 3 years earlier. James was competent with explosives and patient with rock, qualities that made him valuable in the mining business. Their claim showed modest promise, enough to justify another season of work, and they had built a standard camp the previous summer, consisting of a notched log cabin, a supply shed, and a sluice box system along the creek that ran through their property. The cabin was typical frontier construction. They had spent 5 days building it the previous June, using pine logs from the surrounding forest, basic corner notching, and moss mixed with mud for chinking. It had a dirt floor, a stone fireplace that drew reasonably well, 1 small window covered with oiled paper, and a plank door hung on leather hinges. By the standards of Montana mining camps, it was adequate shelter. It kept out wind and rain. It held heat from the fireplace well enough that they could sleep through winter nights without freezing. It had served them through the previous winter without significant problems. But that early winter brought strange weather. November stayed warm, with temperatures often climbing into the 50s during midday. The snow that fell melted within days. The creek ran higher than normal for the season. Old-timers in Helena talked about similar conditions they remembered from 1864, the year before the territory's worst recorded winter, but most prospectors dismissed such talk as the perpetual pessimism of men who had seen too many hard seasons. Elias didn't dismiss it. He watched the weather with growing unease, noting details that others overlooked. The ravens stayed in the high country longer than usual. The deer moved down from the mountains earlier than expected. The ice that formed on the creek each night was thinner than it should be for late November. Everything suggested the mountains were holding their breath, waiting for something. James thought Elias worried too much. On the 1st of December, sitting by their fireplace after a day of mucking ore, James pointed out that they had plenty of firewood stacked, enough supplies to last until spring, and a solid cabin. What more did winter require? Elias didn't have a good answer. His concerns were based on instinct and observation, not logic that could be easily defended. January 3, 1895, began as an ordinary winter morning. The temperature stood at 12 degrees above zero when James left the cabin at first light to check their sluice boxes downstream. Ice had been building up in the system, and he wanted to clear it before it caused problems with their spring operations. Elias stayed behind to sort ore samples they had extracted the previous week, work that required good light and concentration. By mid-morning, Elias noticed the temperature dropping. This wasn't the gradual cooling that came with normal weather fronts. This was something different. Within 2 hours, the thermometer outside their cabin window fell from 12 degrees to -8. The wind picked up from the northwest, carrying a peculiar smell that Elias associated with deep cold, something metallic and sharp that seemed to come from far beyond the mountains. By noon, the temperature had dropped to -26 degrees. Elias had never seen anything fall so fast. He stepped outside and felt the cold hit his lungs like a physical force. The wind cut through his wool coat as though the fabric didn't exist. He looked toward the creek where James had gone and felt the first stirrings of genuine fear. James should have returned hours ago. The sluice boxes were only 2 miles downstream, an easy walk that usually took less than an hour each direction. But the cold was now dangerous, the kind that could kill a man in minutes if he wasn't careful. And James had left that morning dressed for 12 degrees above zero, not the -30 that Elias now read on the thermometer. Elias grabbed extra blankets, his heaviest buffalo coat, and his rifle. He left the fire burning and headed downstream, following the creek path that James would have taken. The wind was brutal, driving snow that felt like sand against his exposed skin. He wrapped a scarf around his face until only his eyes showed, but even that small exposure began to hurt within minutes. He found James 3 miles from camp, not 2. His partner had collapsed beside the creek, his work on the sluice boxes apparently completed before the temperature became lethal. James must have started back but succumbed to the cold somewhere along the return journey. He was still alive when Elias reached him, but barely. His lips were blue, his breathing shallow, and his hands showed the waxy white appearance of severe frostbite. Elias tried to get James walking, but his partner couldn't support his own weight. The temperature was still dropping, now approaching -35 degrees. Elias had no choice but to carry him. He slung James over his shoulders and started back toward camp, moving as fast as the burden and conditions allowed. The journey back took nearly 3 hours. Elias had to stop twice to rest, each time terrified that he wouldn't be able to start moving again. The cold penetrated everything. His buffalo coat, the blankets wrapped around James, his boots, all seemed useless against the deep cold that was settling over the mountains. James Brennan died on the cabin floor at 8 o'clock that evening, despite everything Elias tried. The frostbite had gone too deep, and the cold had stolen too much of his core temperature before Elias found him. Elias wrapped his partner's body in blankets and placed it in the supply shed, where the frozen ground would preserve it until spring burial became possible. That night, the temperature dropped to 41 degrees below zero. Inside the cabin, despite a roaring fire that consumed wood at an alarming rate, the interior temperature hovered around 28 degrees. Ice formed on the interior walls, where moisture from breathing met the freezing logs. The cold seemed to penetrate the wood itself, making the entire structure feel like it was made of ice rather than timber. Elias spent that night feeding the fire and thinking about how inadequate his shelter truly was. The logs that had seemed solid in summer were just barriers against wind, nothing more. The cold moved through them as though they barely existed. The chinking between logs cracked and fell away as the wood contracted in the extreme temperature. The door, despite being closed and barred, allowed cold air to pour through gaps around its frame. The brutal cold lasted 6 weeks. The temperature never rose above -15 degrees during that entire period, and most nights it fell below -30. Elias survived by staying close to the fire, wearing every piece of clothing he owned, and rationing his firewood carefully. He ventured outside only when absolutely necessary to gather more wood from his stack or to perform essential tasks. During those 6 weeks, Elias observed everything. He noticed that the cold penetrated the cabin from all directions simultaneously. The walls, the floor, the roof, everything was a pathway for heat to escape and cold to enter. He realized that fighting the cold with fire was a losing battle. The fire could warm the air temporarily, but the structure itself remained frozen, constantly pulling heat away from the interior space. He also observed nature. From his small window, he watched ravens and other birds disappear entirely during the coldest days. He saw no deer, no elk, no wolves. Nothing moved on the surface. But he knew animals were surviving somewhere. They had to be. Ground squirrels didn't freeze to death every winter. Bears hibernated in dens. Badgers retreated to burrows. They all went underground where the cold couldn't reach them. Elias remembered his childhood in Ohio, helping his father maintain a root cellar that stayed cool in summer and never froze in winter. The temperature below ground remained constant regardless of surface conditions. His father had explained it once, something about the earth holding its temperature below a certain depth, but Elias had been young and hadn't paid attention to the details. Now those details seemed crucial. If the Earth maintained constant temperature, if animals survived underground while the surface became lethal, then perhaps the solution wasn't building stronger walls above ground. Perhaps the solution was abandoning the surface entirely. Spring arrived in late March, 6 weeks later than normal. When the snow finally melted enough for travel, Elias packed his modest silver ore samples and made the journey to Helena. Other prospectors who survived the winter told stories of frozen livestock, collapsed cabins, and narrow escapes. 3 men had died in the mountains within 50 miles of Helena. James Brennan was one of 7 confirmed deaths in the broader region. Elias sold his silver for $640, enough to fund another year of work. Most prospectors would have spent half that amount on whiskey and entertainment after a winter like the one they had endured. Elias spent 2 days in Helena, studying everything he could find about underground construction. He visited the public library and read about coal mines in Pennsylvania, learning how miners worked hundreds of feet below ground in spaces that remained 55 degrees year-round, regardless of surface temperature. He talked to a civil engineer who was surveying routes for a potential railroad and learned about frost line depths and how soil temperatures stabilized below certain depths. He spent an afternoon with a man who had worked on the Northern Pacific Railroad tunnel through Mullen Pass, asking questions about tunnel stability and ventilation. Then he began purchasing supplies. Other prospectors watched with confusion as Elias bought equipment that made no sense for mining operations. He purchased 3 heavy shovels with reinforced blades designed for excavation work. He bought 2 pickaxes specifically made for breaking rock in confined spaces. He acquired 30 feet of canvas duck cloth, heavy material typically used for wagon covers. He purchased 20 sheets of tin that could be formed into a chimney pipe. The hardware store owner asked what he was building. Elias explained his plan to construct an underground shelter for the next winter. The owner looked at him like he had lost his mind during the cold months, but sold him the materials anyway. Word spread through Helena's prospecting community quickly. The man who lost his partner was planning to live in a hole in the ground like an animal. Elias also sought knowledge from sources most white prospectors ignored. He spent 2 days with a Blackfoot family camped near the outskirts of Helena, asking about traditional earth lodge construction. The family's elder, a man named Running Elk, described how his people had built semi-subterranean winter lodges for generations, using earth berms and sunken floors to create spaces that stayed warm with minimal fire. Running Elk drew diagrams in the dirt, showing how to create proper ventilation and how to position the entrance to prevent cold air from flowing into the living space. By mid-May, Elias returned to his claim with a loaded mule and a detailed plan. Other prospectors he encountered on the trail asked about his unusual cargo. He explained what he intended to build and why. Most responded with skepticism or outright mockery. A few nodded thoughtfully but said nothing. One old trapper simply said that if Elias survived next winter comfortably, others would pay attention. Elias selected his construction site with the same care most men reserved for choosing a wife. He spent 3 days walking the hillsides around his claim before settling on a south-facing slope 200 yards from his old cabin. The location offered several advantages. The southern exposure meant maximum sunlight during winter months. The slope provided natural drainage away from the entrance. The soil was a mixture of clay and rock that would hold its shape once excavated, but wasn't so dense that digging would be impossible. He began excavation on July 8, 1895. The first step was marking out the dimensions of his main chamber, 12 feet wide by 10 feet deep. He started digging into the hillside horizontally rather than straight down, creating a tunnel entrance that would slope gradually upward into the main living space. This design was critical. Cold air was heavier than warm air and would naturally flow downward and out through a lower entrance rather than settling in the living space. The digging was brutal work. Elias removed approximately 400 cubic feet of earth and rock over the first 2 weeks. He used his pickaxe to break up compacted soil and rock, then shoveled the loose material into a wooden sled that he dragged outside and dumped down the hillside. Each day he advanced roughly 2 feet deeper into the slope. His hands developed calluses on top of existing calluses. His back ached constantly. But he worked methodically, refusing to rush. By early August, he had excavated the main chamber. The space was roughly 12 feet wide, 10 feet from front to back, and 7 feet high at the center. The walls weren't perfectly smooth, but they were stable. He had been careful to maintain a slight dome shape to the ceiling, which helped distribute the weight of earth above and reduce the risk of collapse. Next came the structural support system. Elias cut pine logs from the surrounding forest, selecting straight trees, approximately 8 inches in diameter. He placed vertical support posts at 4 corners of the chamber and along the side walls, spacing them 4 feet apart. Across the top of these posts, he laid horizontal ridge logs that would support the roof structure. The roof itself required careful engineering. He laid logs across the chamber, spanning from side wall to side wall, spacing them 12 inches apart. These logs were notched where they met the ridge supports to prevent shifting. Over these, he placed split planks he had prepared using a froe and mallet, creating a relatively flat surface. The planks overlapped like shingles. Over the planks, he laid his canvas in 2 layers, overlapping the seams. The canvas would serve as a moisture barrier, preventing water from seeping through the earth above. Over the canvas, he began placing earth. He started with 6 inches of soil, tamping it down carefully. Then he added another 12 inches. Finally, he placed sod strips he had cut from a nearby meadow, creating a living roof that would root and stabilize. September brought the detailed work that would determine whether Elias froze or survived. The excavated chamber was weatherproof, but it wasn't livable yet. The systems that would make underground life sustainable required precise execution and careful problem-solving. The chimney presented the greatest technical challenge. Standard cabin chimneys ran straight up through the roof, a simple vertical path for smoke. Elias's chimney had to travel through 8 feet of earth before reaching the surface, and it needed to avoid creating a cold air shaft that would drain heat from his living space. He solved this by designing a chimney with 2 angles. From his fireplace, the chimney rose vertically for 3 feet, then angled at 45 degrees for 4 feet, then rose vertically again for the final 6 feet to the surface. He constructed it using his tin sheets formed into pipes and sealed with a mixture of clay and ash. The angled sections served 2 purposes. They prevented rain and snow from falling directly down the chimney into his fire, and they created a path where heat from the smoke would transfer into the surrounding earth rather than being lost directly to the outside air. The fireplace itself was built against the back wall using flat stones he collected from the creek. He constructed it smaller than typical cabin fireplaces, only 2 feet wide and 18 inches deep. A smaller firebox would be more efficient, requiring less wood while producing concentrated heat. He included a stone shelf inside the chimney 6 inches above the firebox that would reflect heat forward into the room rather than allowing it all to escape upward. Ventilation required separate consideration. Fire consumed oxygen, and a sealed underground space would suffocate him if fresh air couldn't enter. He created an air intake by digging a narrow shaft from the ceiling of his chamber at the front corner opposite his fireplace. The shaft angled upward through the earth and emerged on the hillside 20 feet from his entrance. He lined it with small diameter logs to prevent collapse and covered the exterior opening with a wooden grate that would allow airflow while keeping out animals and debris. The entrance tunnel received multiple refinements. Elias built a door frame 8 feet inside the entrance, using heavy timbers mortised together. He constructed a thick plank door reinforced with crossbeams and hung it on iron hinges he had fabricated from scrap metal. This inner door would be his primary seal against cold. At the exterior entrance, he built a second lighter door that would prevent snow from drifting into the tunnel and provide an additional barrier against wind. Between the 2 doors, he created an airlock space where cold air could be trapped rather than flowing directly into his living area. He also dug a small sump pit in the floor of this space where melting snow and water could drain away rather than flowing into the main chamber. His sleeping platform was built against the right wall, raised 30 inches above the floor, using log framework with planks across the top. The first cold snap arrived on October 22nd, earlier than anyone expected. The temperature dropped from 45 degrees during the afternoon to 18 degrees by midnight. Other prospectors in the valley scrambled to seal gaps in their cabins and stack extra firewood near their doors. Elias simply closed both of his bunker doors and monitored what happened inside his underground chamber. The exterior temperature continued falling overnight, reaching 8 degrees above zero by dawn. Inside the bunker, Elias's thermometer read 51 degrees. He had a small fire burning in his fireplace, using perhaps 1/3 the wood he would have needed in a surface cabin to maintain comparable warmth. The earth surrounding his chamber held its temperature regardless of what happened on the surface, and that stable mass kept his living space comfortable. Over the next 3 weeks, Elias refined his system through observation and adjustment. He discovered that condensation formed on the interior walls where warm air from his fire met the cooler earth. He addressed this by hanging canvas along the walls, creating an air gap that reduced the temperature differential. The canvas absorbed moisture during the day and released it slowly, preventing water from dripping down the earthen walls. He learned that his ventilation shaft worked almost too well during high winds, creating drafts that pulled heat from the room. He solved this by installing a simple damper at the interior opening, a flat piece of wood that could be positioned to control airflow. On calm days, he left it fully open. During windstorms, he closed it partially while ensuring his fireplace still drew properly. The entrance airlock proved its value during the first significant snowfall in early November. 6 inches of heavy wet snow fell overnight. In the morning, Elias opened his inner door to find snow had drifted into the entrance tunnel, but stopped at the outer door. He cleared the snow easily, and the inner chamber had remained completely dry and warm. A surface cabin would have required clearing snow from the door just to exit, and cold air would have poured inside during the process. On November 15th, a prospector named Arthur Colson stopped by while traveling between claims. Arthur had worked the mountains for 12 years and knew most of the remote camps in the region. He had heard stories about Elias's underground shelter and wanted to see it himself. Elias gave him a tour, showing how the systems worked together. Arthur was skeptical, but couldn't argue with the results. The outside temperature that afternoon was 22 degrees. Inside the bunker, it was 50 degrees with only a small fire burning. Arthur touched the earthen walls and felt the stable temperature. He examined the chimney design and nodded slowly, beginning to understand the principles involved. Arthur asked how much firewood Elias expected to use through winter. Elias estimated perhaps 1/3 of what a surface cabin required. Arthur thought about his own cabin and the enormous woodpile he had spent weeks cutting and stacking. He didn't say much, but Elias could see him calculating. December 18, 1895, began with an unusual stillness. The air pressure felt wrong, creating a sensation in Elias's ears like being underwater. He had learned to trust such feelings during his years in the mountains. By midday, the sky had turned a peculiar gray-yellow color that he had never seen before. The temperature was -4 degrees, cold but not exceptional. Then the wind started. Within 2 hours, the wind reached speeds that Elias estimated at 60 miles per hour or more. It wasn't the gusting wind of normal storms, but a sustained howl that seemed to come from every direction simultaneously. The temperature dropped precipitously. By sunset, it had fallen to -28 degrees. By midnight, -37. The storm was just beginning. Elias sealed his outer entrance door and retreated to the inner door, closing it firmly and dropping the wooden bar into place. Inside his bunker, he lit his fire and settled in to wait. The wind above ground was so loud he could hear it clearly, even through 8 feet of earth. It sounded like a freight train that never passed, a constant roaring that went on hour after hour. On the second day of the storm, the temperature outside dropped to 43 degrees below zero. The wind continued without pause. Snow fell so heavily that visibility above ground would have been measured in feet rather than yards. Elias knew this because he cracked his outer door briefly to check conditions and was met with a wall of white and a blast of cold so intense it hurt to breathe. Inside the bunker, his thermometer read 50 degrees. He wore a single wool shirt and felt comfortable. His small fire burned steadily, consuming perhaps 6 pieces of firewood per day. He had food, water from snow he melted in a pot, and light from a single lantern. He read from a book about Roman engineering that he had purchased in Helena, cooked simple meals, and listened to the storm rage above him. The storm continued for 10 days without meaningful pause. This wasn't a blizzard in the conventional sense, where storms came in waves with breaks between. This was sustained assault on everything above ground. The temperature never rose above minus 30 degrees during those 10 days. The wind never stopped. Snow accumulated at rates that Elias couldn't accurately measure, but knew were unprecedented. He thought about other prospectors in the valley. He knew of at least 5 camps within 20 miles. Their cabins were standard construction, built quickly to provide basic shelter. They would be fighting for survival right now, burning enormous amounts of firewood, struggling to keep interior temperatures above freezing, dealing with snow forcing its way through gaps in walls and roofs. Elias worked in his shirt sleeves, comfortable and safe 8 feet below the surface, while the worst blizzard in Montana territorial history tried to kill everything above ground. On December 28th, the wind finally stopped. Elias opened his outer door on the morning of December 29th to find 8 feet of snow had drifted against the hillside, covering his entrance completely. He spent 2 hours digging a tunnel upward through the snow using a shovel, creating a narrow passage that finally broke through to open air. The sky was clear and blue, almost mocking after 10 days of violence. The temperature had risen to minus 12 degrees, which felt almost warm by comparison. What he saw when he climbed out of his snow tunnel shocked him despite his expectations. The landscape had been transformed into something alien. Snow covered everything in drifts that reached 12 to 15 feet in places. Trees that had stood for decades were snapped off at their trunks or torn from the ground entirely. The creek was buried under snow so deep that Elias couldn't tell where the water ran. His old cabin, the one he had shared with James the previous winter, had collapsed. The roof had caved in under the weight of snow, and the walls had buckled outward. If anyone had been sheltering there during the storm, they would have died. Elias put on snowshoes he had made the previous fall and began checking on other prospectors in the valley. The first camp he reached, 3 miles northeast of his claim, was abandoned. The cabin stood but showed significant damage. The door had been torn completely off its hinges by the wind. Snow had filled the interior to a depth of 4 feet. No one was there, and Elias found no signs of recent habitation. Whoever had been working this claim had left before the storm arrived. The second camp told a darker story. Elias found a collapsed cabin with smoke stains on the snow around it, indicating someone had been there during the storm trying to maintain a fire. He dug through the wreckage and found the body of a prospector he knew slightly, a man named Robert Hutchins, who had come from Missouri 2 years earlier. Robert had frozen to death when his cabin collapsed, probably on the 3rd or 4th day of the storm. The third camp belonged to Arthur Colson. Elias approached it with growing dread. Arthur's cabin was still standing but badly damaged. One corner had been torn apart, probably where wind had found a weakness in the construction. The door hung from a single hinge. Elias called out but heard no response. He found Arthur inside, alive but in desperate condition. Arthur was wrapped in every blanket he owned, huddled against the fireplace where a tiny fire barely smoldered. He had severe frostbite on both hands and his feet. He had been burning furniture and pieces of his own cabin walls to stay alive after his firewood ran out on the 7th day of the storm. He looked at Elias with eyes that didn't quite focus and said he thought he was hallucinating. Elias carried Arthur back to the bunker on a makeshift sled, a journey that took 4 hours through deep snow. Arthur spent 3 weeks recovering in the stable warmth of the underground shelter, gradually regaining feeling in his extremities, though he would lose 2 toes and the tips of 3 fingers to frostbite. During those weeks, Arthur studied every aspect of Elias's construction, asking detailed questions about excavation technique, ventilation design, and the thermal principles that made underground living superior to surface cabins. The blizzard of 1895 killed 11 people in Montana Territory, 3 of them prospectors in the valley where Elias worked. When spring arrived and survivors began moving through the mountains, again, word spread about the man who had weathered the storm underground in comfort while others fought for survival. Prospectors stopped at Elias's claim to see the bunker themselves, examining the entrance, the airlock system, the angled chimney, and the earthen walls that had maintained steady temperature through 10 days of -40-degree weather. By the following autumn, 7 dugout shelters had been constructed at various claims throughout the northern Rockies. Each incorporated principles Elias had developed, though individual designs varied based on specific site conditions and available materials. Arthur Colson built his own earth-sheltered dwelling using a natural cave he expanded and modified, adding Elias's airlock entrance and angled chimney design. The shelter served him well for 15 more winters in the mountains. The technique spread slowly but persistently through the prospecting community. Men who had mocked the idea of living underground reconsidered after nearly freezing to death. The phrase "Kern-style dugout" entered the vocabulary of mountain men and prospectors, signifying construction that prioritized thermal efficiency and storm protection over speed or conventional appearance. Elias continued working his silver claim until 1903. His underground shelter required minimal maintenance over those 8 years. The living roof grew thick with grass and wildflowers each summer. The earthen walls never cracked or deteriorated. The systems he had engineered continued functioning exactly as designed. He survived 7 more serious winter storms without difficulty, using a fraction of the firewood his neighbors consumed. In 1903, Elias sold his claim to a younger prospector and moved to Butte with enough money to live modestly. He married a widow named Catherine in 1905 and worked as a consulting engineer for mining operations, applying his understanding of underground construction to shaft and tunnel design. He died in 1911 at age 58 from pneumonia, surrounded by his family, his life having been far longer than most men who spent decades in the mountains could expect. Arthur Colson continued prospecting until 1918, always living in earth-sheltered dwellings. He survived conditions that killed others simply by working with the land rather than trying to conquer it. Elias's original bunker remained structurally sound into the 1920s when shepherds used it as seasonal shelter. Archaeological surveys in the 1970s located and documented the site, noting the sophisticated engineering that had allowed one man to survive what nature intended to be unsurvivable.